Hello, and welcome to what should be a fun little video. I kind of thought something I should do. Start with the answer to the thumbnail. No, you shouldn't do it if you want something easy. Do it if you want a challenge and something that is just awesome. There, that's the only reason to do this. So let's go over just a quick overview of where we are, how we got here, and what's the path forward. What we have here is a 1987 Jeep Comanche that ran super stock paved oval racing. At least that's to the best of my knowledge, what I've been able to dig up. Regulations weren't really digital when this was running. This would have been running based on the belts that were in it and the stickers of feature and heat winners. It would have been running circa 2000, late 90s, very early 2000s. The belts expired in 2003. So, yeah, it was a paved oval racer. I would have ran short paved ovals. The paved oval in particular that it has stickers from is Caraway Raceway in North Carolina. The truck itself has stickers on it from Richmond, Virginia. I picked it up in Martinsville, Virginia, only like 2 miles from the Speedway, which was really cool. Got a chance to get some pictures of it in front of that. It may not be the fastest thing. It's not going to throw you in the back of the seat. It's a 2.5 liter, if I haven't mentioned that. It's a 2.5 liter AMC straight force of habit Jeep guy. I want to say straight six. It's a 4-cylinder. So yeah, it's just your regular 2.5. It's backed by an AX4, the 4-speed transmission. It's a good ratio for oval. Also pretty okay for what I did with it. So that's what the truck is. So let's get into the details of why you shouldn't rally cross or rally sprint a paved oval truck. All right, to start off, and you're going to have to bear with me a little bit, and as I'll discuss more later, I've already begun the transformation to make this capable of doing rally cross and rally sprint. The first thing with paved oval that you need to account for is the cars, or trucks in this case, aren't designed really to up travel much or down travel that much. Your suspension travel is going to be very limited. You don't want the suspension moving a whole lot when you're going around the track. So you lower the thing as much as you can. You get it low to the ground. You make it stiff so that way it stays really planted. A side effect of that, especially when you're lowering a truck to this extent, is there was no bump stops. The suspension being very stiff and low with no bump stops caused quite a lot of issues. Main one being, if you can look carefully here, you can see my crappy welding job. But yeah, there was a pretty big hole in the frame here, and I can probably throw up a picture of what it looked like before, from the edge of this bracket where the shock would have mounted, getting into the frame up here. And that wasn't the only thing that was getting into the frame and hitting things, as I found. It was quite a lot. You can actually see a witness mark here where I believe that was the spring itself was making contact with the, I think that's the torsion bar mount. We had the sway bar link, when this is under compression, was actually hitting up here where the battery box is protruded into the body. And it would have definitely been hitting the battery, the old battery that was in there. If we move over, I got a welder in the way. You see all of these marks, like how beat up this tie rod is. That's because this tie rod was coming up and slamming into the torsion bar. And how I didn't break that is beyond me. You can also see I got new control arms here, but the old control arms were actually going all the way up to the motor mount and smashing into the motor mount. And after that rally sprint, I was missing a motor mount bolt, which I originally thought I didn't tighten it. But now I suspect it's probably due to me smashing the motor mount with the control arm. If we look on the other side, you can see same thing. The control arm was getting into the motor mount, and also at some point contacted the oil filter. This side actually remained pretty unscathed because we didn't have the protrusion from the battery box on this side, and this side, as I discovered when I started pulling apart the suspension, had an 800-pound, roughly, spring based on the measurements I took on it, while the passenger side had a 600-pound spring. You can see some witness marks of what I believe was my steering stabilizer down here getting in contact with the frame. You got to remember, right now the suspension is at full droop with no shocks on it, so all of this would be up much higher. On top of that, we moved back on the vehicle a bit. We'll come over here to what I have removed already. This is our trans cross member. This, before we rallied it, was perfectly straight. And you can probably tell by how the light's hitting it now. It's caved in. There's practically no paint on that lower surface because, and you can see it in the rally video that I did, we were dragging it, like, constantly, and beating it up quite bad, and it was quite a concern, especially also loading and unloading the vehicle, or going under or going over low, like speed bumps, stuff like that. I was hitting it quite regularly. And actually, while we're here, we can look. These control arms are stamped steel part, and it's incredible how much this thin gauge stamped steel control arm was doing damage to the motor mount. And you can see it didn't handle it well, but I'm surprised it wasn't worse than it was. All right, and moving back to the last portion of the kind of aftermath and damage of rally crossing a paved oval truck, is this bit of frame damage where the U-bolts were hitting the frame. If we come outside, you can see the extent of how bad it was. And Once again, this is a result of the fact that the truck not really designed to have much up travel. You're not expecting to really experience much with how stiff it is and everything. However, in rally, that's a different story, and no bump stop means U-bolts in the frame, and it makes for very poor driving characteristics. So yeah, on the subject of driving characteristics, let's discuss a little bit of what it was like to drive the truck. So, the overall driving characteristics of it, and what I talked to people about when I did it on the day and short periods afterwards, um, I said it was surprisingly good. And it was technically surprisingly good because my expectations were just completely undrivable. I was expecting it to just not be able to be driven at all. I was expecting to break something pretty fairly significant early on and be done. I wasn't planning on doing this. It just kind of circumstances worked out, and I said, let's send it as is and see what happens. I'll figure out all the things that are going to go wrong, and I have, and fix them. So yeah, the driving characteristics, while not undrivable, pretty close to undrivable. Um, you had very stiff but uneven front suspension, which would lead to no confidence. You couldn't trust what the truck was going to do. It would soak up some bounces, but others it would pogo and just continue to pogo because the shocks were blown out and it wouldn't really dampen. So it would bounce. So you had to enter sharp turns tentatively and see what the truck would do, and so you can respond to it. If you went full in and it bounced, you'd be in trouble. Then, once you've gotten through that turn, you had to worry about what the back was going to do. So, what the back was doing is it was fully compressing, as you can see by the damage to the frame, and those U-bolts would hit the frame, completely unload the suspension, and it would go in a direction. What direction it went, you don't know. It would just pick a direction, what happened to be steering input, and what direction it was going at the time that it made contact would send it in a direction, and you had no warning. You had no time to respond. It would just happen, and it would snap, and then you would have to fight to try to get it back under control, and that would usually then upset the front end and make it unhappy. So it was a handful, and it was a lot of exhausting work to drive it and keep it on course. I took out a lot of cones when it turned into when I did the Rallycross the next day, and a subsequent, that's a tough word to say, event later on with Susquehanna. I took out a lot of cones just because it's difficult and a handful to keep that truck under control, and it's exhausting. And at points, I was just struggling to keep the truck under control. So that's what it was driving like. Now let's actually talk a little bit about what I'm doing to try to correct all these things, because while this is not the right vehicle and why you shouldn't go trying to convert a paved oval vehicle if you want an easy rallycross car, it's going to make a cool one, but it's going to take a lot of work, and I've been hard at work, as you probably have already seen some of it as I've been talking through the damage and things like that. Let's talk more in detail of everything that we're doing. All right. Starting at the back, you can probably tell by the yellow paint what I'm planning on doing here, and we can see in more detail what I'm doing over there. So yeah, While this is not strictly necessary, I could put bump stops back in the truck and it would resolve this issue with the axle getting in contact with the frame. What it wouldn't solve is the kind of underlining issue with this of the axle doesn't quite have enough up travel for what it's capable of. It can travel up higher than the frame is allowing it. And if I just threw bump stops in, it would make it essentially okay to run because it's not going to cause frame damage, but it's not going to handle any different. It's going to handle pretty much the exact same. It won't snap quite as hard when it hits the frame because you have a rubber there to absorb some of the impact, but it's still going to have a similar effect when you hit the bump stop. So to try to improve upon that, I am notching the frame. It'll allow for about 2 more inches total of travel of the axle. And that was based off of figuring out how much room I had between the pumpkin and the floor, because I really don't want to clearance the floor to allow the axle to get any higher than that, especially since directly above the axle is where the fuel cell is located currently. So if we move to the other side, we can actually see the cut itself. So now this is something I don't do at all. This is a new thing for me. I don't build race cars. I don't build anything really. So I'm a let's say a math person at work, do data analysis, stuff like that. I'm not a fabricator. I don't do anything like that. This is kind of my first foray into it, and I'm learning as I go. And I am kind of taking something you pick up over the years, and a lot of the people in the automotive community have been pushing, people that I follow, such as like Vice Grip Garage and David Freiberger and Mike Finnegan, those people from Motor Trend and Roadkill and other people that do this kind of stuff. It's not to get it perfect or get it everything perfectly right. It's to get it done and just do things, make progress. You're going to screw things up. You're not going to get it perfect, but you get some experience and then you learn how to do it better the next time. So these aren't perfect cuts. It's not going to look show quality, but it'll be strong enough and it'll get me what I need to do. So yeah, it'll allow for about 2 inches more clearance. I am going to be putting gussets in here. I've already kind of been mocking them up, kind of what I'm planning on doing. Be one on each side, and then this will be fully enclosed. So it's a full box section. It'll be plenty strong for what I'm doing, and should get me some extra travel. On top of the extra travel, the other thing I'm doing is I am going to mount a set of pneumatic bump stops to the truck. And for those not familiar, and I'll pull these out, this is roughly where it'll be mounted. So that way at full compression, it'll be stopping just short of the frame. So if you're not familiar with these pneumatic bump stops, the main purpose of these is to try to control that impact you have at full compression. So rubber bump stops do that to a degree. They have a softness to them and they give. So they kind of slow the impact, make it less harsh to a degree. What the pneumatic bump stops is make that a tunable, more progressive impact. These particular ones that I have are a 2-inch travel. So it'll travel 2 inches before it bottoms out. And it essentially gives you a kind of, like, you have helper springs for taking up extra load on like heavy duty trucks. It's similar to that kind of concept of, it's not in use all the time, but when you have a instance like a heavy hit, instead of hitting the bump stop, you have a secondary, essentially, shock absorber that increases your shock absorption capacity and progressively slows down that impact. And these are tunable. You can adjust pressure and kind of modify it so it's a more controlled event and makes it way easier to handle. How well this will work in a rallycross, rally sprint vehicle, I have no idea. I haven't had any experience of people using these. I haven't really seen anyone use these before, and I thought it might be something interesting to try for my application. I have a lot of room to play with compared to a lot of vehicles, and I have a lot of freedom to place these and use these. These are mostly used in Baja racing, high speed, off-road racing with pretty intense conditions. Not typically, or the other is people use them in rock crawling, which seems odd to me, because you don't really need, this is more for a high speed impact and trying to keep the vehicle settled. You don't really need it for like a slow impact that you would have in rock crawling. But anyway, I digress. So that's the other thing I'm trying as far as the rear suspension to tame it, is to kind of control that impact that I have, along with the whole extra travel I'm going to have. All right, the next upgrade I worked on, and I talked a little bit about it, is the Transcross member. Now, the goal with the Transcross member, and just kind of philosophy I've been working on while building this, is to keep everything up and out of the way. I don't want things dragging. I don't want things to get caught up for when I'm loading it, unloading it, as well as just if it's down low and it's making contact, eventually it will break in rally. You're pushing the vehicle, you're hurting the vehicle. It's not if you're going to break something, it's how you're going to break it and when you're going to break it. So the more I can get things up out of the way where they're not getting into collisions, the longer they're going to last and the better things are going to work out. So what I did was I went and bought myself your standard cheap $70 universal transmission mount and went about trying to make my own custom attachment for it. Trying to make it work for my application. I went with the straight bar because I knew that based on measurements I took, it would fit in this pocket where the frame rail is for the unibody, because it is a unibody at this point in the vehicle. And it's got a lot of support in this area, and it's also where the factory one went, so everything in here is more reinforced than other parts of the frame rail. I welded it as best I could at the time with a Eastwood welder that is very old and had a bad gas line, so I was using flux core, and the metal I had been using had oil that kind of seeped into it and that did not want to come out, so my welds are very ugly, but should hold for what I need, hopefully. This is something I'm going to learn as I go, and like I said, at the time when I was making it, it was, this is what I have, let's do it and learn, find out how well it'll work. It's all 1/4 inch plate, so as long as I have enough glue in there, it should hold together just fine. But the end result of this was it moved everything up approximately 3 inches. So the old cross member would have hung down quite a bit below where the cross member is now, and that's what led to most of the dragging. So this now sits pretty flush with the frame rail. It's a little bit lower. If we come from a side angle, you can see we sit maybe about a full inch below the frame rail, but it's quite a bit better than it was. And the other thing on that same lines is with that change in the trans cross member, I had to run the exhaust different, because the exhaust comes out of the collector to a flange here and was a straight shot all the way back and then went out under the frame rail over there. I couldn't do that now because I had the trans cross member in the way, as well as I wanted to get that exhaust up and out of the way. So I went and I took my time, and as you can probably tell by some of these welds, I went and got myself a different welder because that Eastwood one wasn't cutting it, and to fix it, I was already partway into getting a new welder. So new welder can do MIG-TIG. I get some more functionality and can make some better welds. So welded up and spent my time making this exhaust much nicer, and went for more of a trick design instead of just popping out under the frame rail where it was before. It was low and dragging because when this truck's at ride height, it's low. There's not a lot of room. So I went up over the frame rail back here where the old fuel filler used to go. So lots of room to play with. And out the body. I've always liked a body exit exhaust, and this kind of gave me a good excuse to do it. And it actually came out really nice. Of all the things I've done so far, I'm most happy about this. It's not going anywhere, but it has give. Should hopefully not put too much stress on the system and break welds or anything like that. Hell yeah! That's rowdy. Woohoo! Alright, so I've got some more ground clearance in the back. Got some plans to make the suspension better in the back. I got more ground clearance moving the exhaust and the transmission. Now we got to get to the big problem, which is fixing that front end suspension situation, because that is where the biggest issues were. I did forget to mention that the last thing I'm going to do to improve the suspension in the back is I am going to flip. I got a couple sets of these brackets for holding the U-bolts, slash spring perch, whatever you want to call it, and I am going to flip it so I have one in front and one behind, so that way I can have a shock forward and a shock back. While that isn't strictly necessary for, I don't think it's going to be the best for suspension characteristics or handling characteristics in the off-road. One of the main reasons I want to do that is in the original suspension setup that this truck had, which is flawed, is there is your upper shock mount They moved to the front. They kind of just welded this piece here, and it broke free from rally racing. Once again, wasn't designed to be going over bumps and dips and all that stuff. Broke that, so I had variable shock length, which is, great. But what I noticed with the way they had these set up, and I'm sure it was great for oval, it created a lot of axle wrap. This axle wanted to rotate around. This whole setup would want to kind of try to flip over, and I mainly wanted to just try to mitigate that as much as possible to prevent breaking U-joints and pinions, stuff like that. So that's the last thing I did in the rear, or I'm going to do in the rear. All right, so front suspension. What we did here was, first, as you probably saw earlier, we got ourselves a nice new set of control arms, twofold for these. One, it's just easier to buy new control arms than try to replace bushings on original control arms, even though I bought bushings for the originals in a feeble attempt to think about doing that, but then I realized it was a bad idea and abandoned it before I started. But the second benefit is, especially in the front, you have your standard polyurethane bushing here, but in the back, you got yourself a swivel joint that allows the whole suspension to articulate and move a little more freely with less binding. Same for the upper control arm. You have it fixed on the axle because there's less need for the articulation there. It's better to have the upper joint based on some research I did. Oh, lost the flash, but based on the research I did, it's better to do it that way. Next thing I did is, as you can see, there used to be a cone here that would have been for mounting the bump stop. I have cut that out, and that is so I can run similar style bump stops that I'm doing in the rear up front. These are about a 3-inch travel, a little bit longer, maybe 2.5-inch travel bump stops, but these will screw in through the original bump stop mount. I'm going to drill that out. It'll go through and run in the middle of the spring, mainly due to space constraints. Just going to be easier to set it up that way. I also have new springs. I got a couple different sets because, once again, I'm not a builder. I don't know what I'm doing. So I kind of just got what I thought will work based on what I think this thing weighs, because I don't know that. And we're going to test it out and see how it goes, and I'll change it if I don't like it. These springs are very easy to change since this is a solid axle vehicle. I could swap out springs at track if I wanted to. It'd be pretty easy to do it at the track. So I went with, right now, these are 450s, 450-pound spring rate springs. I sprung for the, pun intended, a little stronger, or I shouldn't say stronger, but more elastic compound that allows the springs to be further apart, but give the same rate. The other thing I did is new sway bar, end links, and bushings, just to tighten that all up, because that was all shot as well. And lastly, which I haven't sorted out how I'm mounting them yet, I got myself a set of, it's hard to get this in frame, Bilstein bypass shocks. Once again, not sure how well these are going to work for my application. I forget what specific model number these are, but I have no idea what they're for, what kind of rates they are. But the main thing I wanted was a bypass shock that would fit in my application, which these will. They will allow for, hopefully, for me to run the truck harder for longer without blowing out shocks. I'm hoping I can get a couple, like, it'd be nice to get a couple 5 years out of a set of shocks. That's optimistic, I realize, but that's what I'm going for. I'm also going to be running these shocks in the rear. I'm going to modify the rear shock mounts to have a portion on the top to accept that threaded rod instead of an eyelet. And I modified those rear leaf shackles that I mentioned about to accept this Heim that is on the end of this shock. So I'll be running the same shocks front and rear for this vehicle. Probably not going to work the best since the weight is going to be different front and rear, but from a availability and replaceability aspect, if I can set it up so I have the same shocks front and rear and make it work, even if it's not perfect, it's way nicer if I lose a shock or if I need to replace them, I can have spares on hand and I can order some extras, especially if they discontinue these shocks in the future, and that's likely to happen because most of the time these things don't last very long. So that is everything I'm doing with the front to try to tame the front end some more, is to soften the front suspension so that way it's less likely to bounce. But at the same point, while I'm making it softer, I'm adding dampeners and a secondary dampener with that bump or pneumatic bump stop to try to keep it from being too soft, to try to make up for the fact that it's going to be wanting to hit that bump stop more frequently. That's a lot of why I wanted to go with the bypass shocks and go with that kind of extra work, is I'm going to be making the suspension work harder by going to a softer spring. But it should make the front end much more predictable and controllable. Once again, I'm not a builder. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm guessing and going to try it. And this is what I'm kind of building the whole truck around, is try things. work on it. Try things out. If they work, great. If they don't work, learn from it and do something better the second time around. And I'm just gonna plug away at it and hopefully build this truck into something epic. I think I'm already on my way there because it was epic to start with, but I'm trying to bring it to the next level. So with that, kind of concludes where the truck is, what it is, and where I'm going with it. So I'm excited to see what this truck becomes and what I can make with it. I'm excited to learn from all this and get better at what I'm doing. And I appreciate if you made it to this part in the video. I know it's going to be something very long-winded and not for everyone, but I wanted to make it for myself mainly, to document what this truck was, what I'm doing with it, why I'm doing it. Remind myself that this is a journey to learn things, get better at things, and continue to improve on what I do and who I am. And that's kind of what I always try to do with everything I've done in my life, is to take things in strides, make mistakes. As someone who grew up constantly stressed out and depressed about making mistakes and not being good enough, I've made it a point that I need to get out of that habit, because it's never gonna allow you to get out of the cycle. So I've pushed myself to make mistakes, do things the wrong way, and learn from it. It's a lot. It's very frustrating for people. I know a lot of times because I will I will do things the wrong way repeatedly till I figure out what I'm doing wrong. While people that have done it multiple times will know the right way, but I need to kind of go through and experience it myself because that's the way I learn and that's the way I want to do things. I can't just hear the right way of doing things and do it the right way. I can take advice and listen to people as far as their advice, um, but for me to truly understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, I got to make the mistakes. I got to do it the wrong way first and learn from it. So, once again, thank you for watching this, and I hope to see you in the future with an update on how all this works. How did my months of effort and planning and learning really goes? I'm hoping for the best, but failure is likely an option. But like I said, we'll learn from it and move forward. Take care.